There is a number that follows Caitlin Clark around this season, and it is not a scoring number. It is the number 7. 7 technical fouls. And in the version of the WNBA rulebook that governs this season, the number that ends her night early, that pulls her off the floor for a game her team may badly need her in, is 8. One more. That is all the room she has left. She reached 7 on a night when nothing about the game itself suggested trouble. Her team was up by more than 30. She had already put together one of the best all-around performances of her season. And then, in the last stretch of a game that had stopped being competitive a long time earlier, she turned toward the scoreboard, said something to an opponent, and picked up a technical foul that most people watching would have forgotten about by morning. Except that this one carried weight the moment on the court never showed. It was her 7th. And under the current rules, 7 is the edge of a cliff. Then, a couple of weeks later, she stepped off that cliff. She picked up what the officials ruled her 8th technical of the season. For about 2 hours, Caitlin Clark was suspended. And then she wasn't. The league erased it before the night was over. In this video, I want to walk you through all of it, slowly and in order. What actually happened on the floor. Why the rule is built the way it is, and when it changed, because the timing matters more than you'd think. How her total got to 7 in the first place, and whether that says something about her temper or something about how she gets guarded. And what one missing game would actually cost the Indiana Fever, on the court and at the box office, in a season where she is the biggest draw the league has. Stay with me, because the story is bigger than one whistle. Let's start with the game, because the setting is part of the story. It was July 22nd, a Wednesday night in Indianapolis, the Fever's last game before the WNBA's All-Star break. Indiana was playing the Connecticut Sun, and it was not close. By the time the final buzzer sounded, the Fever had won 123-88. That is a 35-point margin. That 123 was not a typo, and it was not a hot streak that cooled off. It was the most points the Indiana Fever had scored in a single game in the entire history of the franchise. A record night. Caitlin Clark was in the middle of it. She finished with 27 points and 11 assists, and she did it in about 3/4 of work, because a game like that doesn't need its stars in the fourth. She shot 8 for 13 from the field, 5 of 9 from the three-point line, and she made all 6 of her free throws. She added a steal and a block for good measure. It was, by any reasonable standard, a terrific and efficient night, the kind of performance that in a normal week would be the entire headline. None of that is what people ended up talking about. What people talked about happened late, in the part of the game that broadcasters politely call garbage time. The score was decided. The starters on both sides were mostly winding down. And on one possession near the baseline, there was contact. Sun guard Saniya Rivers and forward Olivia Nelson-Ododa were both around Clark on the play, and a hard foul was whistled. In the moment, the foul itself wasn't especially controversial. Hard fouls happen. Late in a blowout, they happen more than you'd like. It was what came after the whistle that turned into something. Words passed between Clark and Rivers. The cameras caught the exchange but not the audio, so we don't know exactly what was said, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What the cameras did catch clearly was Clark turning and gesturing toward the scoreboard. A lead already well past 20 points, and a wordless little message pointing at it. The meaning wasn't hard to read. It was something close to, "Why are we still playing this hard, in a game that's already over?" Now, was that gesture really about that one foul? Or was it about something that had been building over the course of a long, physical season? I can't tell you for certain, and neither can anyone who wasn't inside that huddle. But I can tell you what the officials did. They didn't wait around to sort out who started it. They assessed technical fouls to both players. A double technical. One for Rivers, one for Clark. A way of closing the moment down rather than deciding who was right. And that double technical is where we have to slow down, because it did two very different things to the two players who received it. Here's the thing about a double technical. By design, it's supposed to be even-handed. The whole point is that the officials aren't picking a side. Two players got into it, so both get charged, and the game moves on. It's less a judgment than a reset button. For Saniya Rivers, that's more or less how it played out. A technical foul on her ledger, sure, but nothing dramatic. It reset a tense moment and everyone went back to the bench. Her season total is not sitting anywhere near a line that matters. For Caitlin Clark, the exact same call meant something completely different. Because she did not walk into that game with a clean slate. She walked in carrying 6 technical fouls already from earlier in the season. So this one, the 7th, didn't just close out a garbage time scuffle. It pushed her one step closer to a place no player wants to be. And that's the strange asymmetry at the heart of this whole story. The same whistle, blown for the same reason on the same play, is a shrug for one player and a genuine problem for the other. Not because the moment was worse for Clark. Because of the arithmetic she was already carrying. So you have to ask the honest question here. Does a single technical foul, handed out in the heat of a blowout that was already decided, really deserve to carry season-long weight? The rulebook's answer is yes. It doesn't care how the moment looked. It doesn't care that the game was a laugher. It counts the 7th the same as it would count any other. And once you understand that, you start to see why a forgettable exchange in a 35-point win became a story that followed Clark for weeks. There's another wrinkle worth holding on to. Referees in a blowout are working a different math than referees in a tight game, whether they'd admit it or not. Late in a game, nobody's going to win or lose on the scoreboard. Reaching for a quick double technical to calm everyone down costs almost nothing competitively. It settles the floor. Now picture the identical exchange, the same words, the same gesture, in the 4th quarter of a 1-point game. Would that same whistle come out? I don't think anyone can answer that with certainty. But it's worth sitting with, because the stakes of that particular technical turned out to be far higher for one player than the moment on the court would ever have suggested. Now, technical fouls in the WNBA are not always final. There's a process. Teams can appeal, and the league reviews the call, and sometimes it gets wiped off the books. It happens more than casual fans realize. Earlier this season alone, the league had already rescinded technicals assessed to several other players around the league. So it wasn't unreasonable for Indiana to think the 7th might get knocked down. The Fever appealed it. The WNBA reviewed it. And the league denied the appeal. That one word, denied, is what turned this from a footnote into a genuine storyline. Because the moment that appeal failed, the 7th technical was locked in. Permanent. On the record. And that made the math official and public in a way it hadn't been before. Caitlin Clark was now, without any ambiguity, one technical foul away from an automatic suspension. Not approaching it in some vague sense. One away. The next one does it. And here's a detail I want you to keep in your back pocket for later, because it becomes important. This was not the first technical the Fever had tried to appeal for Clark this season, and up to this point, none of those appeals had worked. She kept the calls. Remember that, because in a few weeks, that pattern was going to break in the most dramatic way possible. But before we get there, we need to understand how she got to 7 at all. Because 7 technicals is a lot. It's a number that invites a certain conclusion. And I think the easy conclusion is the wrong one. Here's the temptation. You see 7 technical fouls next to a player's name, and your brain fills in a story. Hot-headed. Can't control herself. Argues with everybody. Discipline problem. I want to push back on that, not because I'm trying to defend anyone, but because the actual details don't fit the easy version. Her 7 technicals this season did not all come from the same place, and they did not arrive in one bad week. Some of them came from disagreements with officials over foul calls. That is the single most ordinary thing in professional basketball. Nearly every high-usage guard in the league picks up techs arguing calls over a long season. It comes with the volume of contact. Others came from exchanges with opposing players, more in the spirit of the Rivers moment, 2 competitors getting into it. Take any one of the 7 on its own, and it looks completely unremarkable for a player who absorbs the kind of contact and defensive attention Clark absorbs on a nightly basis. It's only when you stack all 7 together that a number starts to look like a pattern. And even then, I'd argue the pattern isn't the one people assume. It doesn't necessarily tell you about a player losing her composure. It tells you about a player operating, night after night, at the very edge of the physical and emotional intensity that comes with being the most closely guarded player in her league. Think about what that actually means in practice. Opposing defenses do not game plan for Caitlin Clark the way they game plan for a normal starter. They build entire schemes around slowing her down specifically. She draws double teams. She draws bodies on drives. She gets grabbed, bumped, and run into on screens far more than most players ever experience, because taking her out of rhythm is the whole ballgame for the other team. When you are the single most targeted player on the floor, possession after possession, frustration is not a character flaw. It's close to an occupational hazard. So the real question is this: is a rising technical count a discipline problem? Or is it a fairly predictable byproduct of exactly how much contact one player is asked to absorb when every defense in the league is built to stop her? The numbers don't settle that cleanly. But I think you have to at least ask it before you treat the number 7 as a simple statement about her temper. And here's a piece of evidence that points toward the second answer. Look at the rest of the Indiana roster. No other Fever player is anywhere near Clark's technical total this season. Not close. Now, that gap isn't shocking once you understand it, because nobody else on that team gets guarded the way she does. Her teammates take contact too, but they don't take the relentless, every single possession defensive attention that comes with being the most tracked player in the sport. That gap is itself a clue that what we're looking at is tied to her role, not simply to her personality. There's a comparison worth making, and it's an imperfect one, so take it as a rough guide rather than a proof. Across basketball history, other high-usage stars who draw enormous defensive attention have tended to rack up technical fouls at elevated rates too. It's a fairly common feature of being the guy or the woman that every defense is obsessed with stopping. That doesn't excuse any single incident. But it complicates the idea that Clark's total says something uniquely damning about her. I'll add one more thing, because it's real and it's a little uncomfortable. Technical fouls get read differently depending on who's collecting them. A grizzled veteran with a long history of jawing at referees gets a certain shrug from fans and media. A young star, still building her public reputation in only her third pro season, gets read a different way entirely, even when the underlying pattern of contact and reaction looks similar. That difference in perception doesn't change the number on the stat sheet. But it absolutely shapes how big a story this becomes. Here's a fact that should reframe the whole "is Clark out of control" conversation. She is not even the only star sitting on 7. Angel Reese, over in Chicago, has been right there with her. The two of them have spent this season near the top of the league's technical foul leaderboard, essentially tied. Two of the sport's most talked about young players, both flirting with the same line, at the same time. And that matters for a specific reason. Because Angel Reese knows exactly what waits on the other side of that line. She found out last season. In 2025, Reese picked up her 8th technical foul, and the WNBA did what the rulebook says it will do. It suspended her. 1 game, no pay. She had to sit. I bring that up not to pile on anybody, but because it kills a comfortable assumption. When a rule like this exists, there's always a temptation to believe it won't really be enforced against the big names. That the league will find a reason to look the other way when a marquee player is 1 tech from sitting. Reese's suspension last year is the proof that the rule has teeth. It is not decorative. When a star crosses the line, the league has, in fact, made her sit. So when we say Caitlin Clark is 1 technical away from a suspension, we are not talking about some theoretical penalty that never actually lands. We just watched it land on a comparable player 1 season ago. That's the weight the number 7 is carrying for her right now. Which brings us to the rule itself. Because to understand why 7 is the danger zone and not, say, 6 or 9, you have to understand a change the league made, and when it made it. For a long time, the WNBA's technical foul suspension threshold sat at 7. A player's 7th technical in a season triggered an automatic 1-game suspension. That was the line for years. If that were still the rule today, this video wouldn't exist. Because under that old standard, Caitlin Clark would already be serving a suspension. Her 7th technical, the Rivers scoreboard tech that the league refused to rescind, would have ended her night early and cost her a game. Done. Case closed. But it didn't. And the reason it didn't is not an oversight. It's that the league moved the line. Here is the part one want to get exactly right, because a lot of the coverage floating around, including the video that probably brought you here, gets the timing wrong. The threshold did not change this season. It changed for the 2025 season. The league raised it from 7 to 8, and it did that alongside a broader expansion, most notably a longer regular season that grew to 44 games. The logic there is reasonable on its face. If you're going to make players grind through more games, giving them one extra technical of margin before a suspension kicks in is a defensible adjustment. More games, a little more rope. So the current rule works like this. Your 8th technical foul in a season triggers an automatic 1-game suspension, without pay. And it doesn't stop there. For every 2 additional technicals after that, you get suspended again. Another game. So the danger doesn't end once you've served the first one. If the count keeps climbing, the suspensions keep coming. The fines climb too, escalating as your total rises, and reaching $1,500 for the 8th technical and every one after it. That rising fine structure was rebuilt around the same time, tied to a new collective bargaining agreement that meaningfully raised player pay. And that makes a certain sense. If salaries go up, a fine schedule that scales up alongside them keeps the penalty meaningful rather than symbolic. Now, I want to be careful and fair here, because this is where a lot of commentary goes off the rails. You will hear people suggest that the league conveniently raised the suspension threshold right as Caitlin Clark, its biggest star and biggest financial draw, was creeping toward the old line. And I understand the instinct, because a suspended Caitlin Clark is genuinely bad for business. Her games draw bigger crowds and bigger television numbers than the league average, pretty much regardless of the opponent. Nobody at the league office is thrilled at the idea of her sitting. But the timeline doesn't actually support the conspiracy. The rule changed for 2025. And in 2025, Clark was nowhere near the limit. She was limited to just 13 games that year by a string of injuries. She wasn't threatening any technical foul threshold at all. The rule that supposedly protects her was written a full season before her technical count made it relevant. So if you want to be honest about it, you can say the higher threshold happens to benefit her now. But you cannot really say it was drawn up to rescue her, because when it was drawn up, she didn't need rescuing. What you can say is that the change quietly reshaped her situation without anyone intending it to. Go back to her rookie year, 2024. She picked up 6 technicals that season. Under the old rule, 6 left her 1 away from a suspension, and there was real hand-wringing about whether she'd cross it before the season ended. She never did. Then came 2025, the injury year. Barely any games, threshold raised, a non-issue. And now 2026, a career high in technicals, a full workload, and a line that has moved but that she has still managed to reach. The rule didn't save her from anything. It just changed how much margin she has left, and it changed it in a way that has now become extremely relevant. If it helps to place this in a bigger context, the WNBA is not doing anything exotic here. The NBA has run a similar escalating system for years, where a player accumulates technicals across a season and starts drawing suspensions once the count passes a set number, with more games tacked on for each additional cluster. The WNBA raising its own number to 8 actually brings it closer in spirit to how its larger sibling league has long handled the same tension. The tension, that is, between wanting a physical, star-driven, emotional product and wanting some consistent, predictable discipline to go with it. Whatever you make of the reasoning, the effect on Clark specifically is not up for debate. She sits at 7, under a rule that gives her exactly 1 more before a suspension becomes automatic. That is a very different place to be standing than 7 would have been under the old rule, where the suspension would already be behind her instead of 1 incident in front of her. And then, right on cue, she took that 1 more step. And the league did something it had refused to do all season. August 8th. Chicago. The Fever were playing the Sky, and it was a heated one, the kind of game where Clark was drawing contact all afternoon. Late in the 3rd quarter, she drove to the basket and got bumped. No foul was called. As her momentum carried her, she passed the ball off to a teammate near the baseline, and that same momentum carried her out of bounds, where she made contact with one of the officials standing there. It was not a shove. By most accounts, it looked like a player whose drive simply carried her into the official's space after a bump she felt should have been a foul. The officials called a technical. And that technical was her 8th. For a couple of hours on that Saturday, Caitlin Clark was, by rule, a suspended player. The 8th technical triggers the automatic 1-game ban, and her next game was Tuesday, at home, against the New York Liberty. One of the marquee matchups on the schedule. She was going to miss it. The Fever won the game itself, 90-86. But the win came with that asterisk hanging over it. And this time, Indiana didn't just grumble. The team appealed immediately, right after the final buzzer. The Fever's head coach, Stephanie White, was direct about it with reporters. She called it plainly, a bad call. And here is where the pattern broke. Remember, the Fever had appealed Clark's technicals before this season, and the league had said no every time, including on the 7th. But this time, the WNBA reviewed the play, agreed that the contact with the official didn't merit a technical, and rescinded it. Less than 2 hours after the game ended, the call was wiped away. Just like that, Clark was unsuspended. Her total dropped back down to 7. She was cleared to play against the Liberty on Tuesday. Crisis over, almost before most fans knew there was one. Now, sit with how strange that whiplash is. In the span of a single afternoon, she went from 7 to 8 and suspended, back to 7 and cleared. The most consequential number in her season swung twice in a couple of hours, decided not on the floor but in a league office reviewing video after the fact. And it wasn't only Clark benefiting from that review process this season. By the time her tech got rescinded, the league had already reversed several other technicals around the league that year, calls that were assessed in the moment and then judged, on review, not to hold up. So Clark's reversal wasn't some special favor invented for her. It was the same after-the-fact review mechanism catching what the league decided was a bad call, the same as it had for others. But the near miss did something important. It showed everyone exactly how thin the margin has become. She didn't approach the line in some abstract, someday sense. She actually crossed it. She was suspended. It only got undone because a review went her way, and reviews do not always go your way. Which means the real lesson of August 8th isn't, she's fine. It's, she is one contested call, one bad whistle, one review that breaks the wrong direction, away from actually sitting. So the question that hangs over the rest of her season is uncomfortable and simple. What happens when there is no rescission to save her? Because the 8th is coming for a lot of physical stars over a long year. And an automatic suspension does not ask your permission, and it does not ask what's on the schedule. Here's the part that makes this genuinely dangerous for the Indiana Fever, and it has nothing to do with Clark's temperament and everything to do with timing. An automatic suspension does not care which game it falls on. It applies to the next scheduled game after the 8th technical is assessed. That's it. It doesn't check the standings. It doesn't check who the opponent is. It doesn't check whether it's a meaningless midweek game against a struggling team or a season-defining clash with a playoff rival. Wherever the next game happens to be, that's the game she misses. Think about what that means for planning. A suspension in a throwaway game against a bottom-of-the-standings opponent barely costs Indiana anything. A suspension in a tight, crucial game against a team they're fighting for playoff seeding could cost them enormously. And there is no way to control which one it turns out to be. Once that 8th technical goes on the board, the date is whatever the next date is. You don't get to pick. You don't get to save it for a soft opponent. The math just lands where it lands. And for this particular team, that unpredictability cuts deeper than it would for almost anyone else, because of how much the Fever run through Clark specifically. Let me be clear about what she does for that team, because it's more than her own scoring. She organizes the offense. She's the engine that makes everything go. The defensive attention she draws, all those double teams and bodies I mentioned earlier, is exactly what opens up driving lanes and clean looks for her teammates. When defenses collapse on her, someone else gets free. Take her off the floor for even one game, and you're not just subtracting her points and assists. You're removing the gravity that makes the rest of the roster function at its current level. So is one missing game a minor inconvenience for a deep, well-built roster? Or does it expose just how dependent this whole system has become on one guard being on the floor? The honest answer is that it depends entirely on who's on the schedule that night, which is precisely why the date-blind nature of the rule makes it so hard to plan around. The Fever's backup ball handlers would have to shoulder a heavier load, and coaching staffs absolutely prepare for exactly this scenario. But preparation and execution against a live, motivated opponent are two different things, and the gap between them tends to show up worst in exactly the kind of high-stakes game you can't schedule the suspension away from. Now, some perspective, because I don't want to overstate this either. History suggests the damage is usually contained. Players who've crossed a technical threshold before, including under the old 7-tech rule, have typically missed exactly one game and then returned to their normal role, with no lingering penalty beyond that single absence. We saw it with Angel Reese last season. One game, then back. So a single suspension is recoverable in the standings. It stings, but it's survivable. The scarier version isn't one game. It's a pattern. Because remember, once you hit 8, every 2 additional technicals brings another suspension. So the real nightmare for Indiana isn't Clark missing one game. It's Clark hitting 8, serving it, and then continuing to accumulate technicals, triggering suspension after suspension down the stretch. One clean absence is a bump in the road. A recurring problem is a different and far more damaging story, and it's the version that would genuinely threaten the Fever season. And that raises a real question about what one suspension even accomplishes. Does serving a single game actually reset anything for a competitive player, psychologically? Or does the pressure just pick right back up the moment she returns to the floor, still one bad night from the next one? I don't think a clean absence resets the underlying dynamic at all. The tightrope is still there when she comes back. There's a whole dimension to this that a purely statistical accounting misses, and it's about what it does to how you play. Knowing you're one technical away changes everything about how you have to handle yourself. Every disputed call now carries a second layer of consequence. A referee blows a whistle you disagree with, and in a normal season you'd bark at him, maybe wave your arms, get it out of your system. Now you can't, because that instinctive reaction is the exact thing that could cost you a game. Every physical exchange with an opponent, every moment of frustration, every no call that makes your blood boil, now has to be swallowed rather than expressed. And here's the difficult part. Everyone on that floor knows the math. The referees know it. The opposing players know it. Clark knows it. It is not a neutral backdrop. It hangs over every contested moment for the rest of her season, which creates an incentive that I think is worth naming plainly, even though I can't prove any specific team is acting on it. If you're an opposing coach or an opposing player looking for any edge against Indiana, the arithmetic is sitting right there in plain view. Get under Clark's skin. Bump her a little harder. Chirp at her a little more. Draw a reaction. You don't have to do anything dirty. You just have to be annoying enough, often enough, that eventually the odds work in your favor and she pops off for a technical she can't afford. Whether teams are consciously doing this, I genuinely can't tell you, and I'm not going to accuse anyone by name. But the incentive exists whether or not anybody's deliberately exploiting it. It sits quietly in the background of every remaining matchup. So the position this puts her in is a strange one for an athlete. Sports usually rewards the competitor who responds, who fires back, who refuses to be pushed around. This rule asks her to do the opposite. It asks for restraint at exactly the moments when the instinct to respond is strongest. And the players who've hit this threshold before her didn't get there by being reckless people. They got there through the accumulated weight of a long season played at maximum intensity, where the 50th hard foul finally gets a reaction the first 49 didn't. Can she navigate the rest of the season without that 8th technical? I don't know. Nobody does. It's not a question you can answer in advance. It's a question the schedule itself is going to answer, one contested call at a time, for as long as that number stays at 7. Let me pull back for a second, because there's a bigger lesson here that outlasts Caitlin Clark specifically. When a league redesigns its disciplinary rules while a huge star is sitting near the old line, it invites scrutiny. It just does. Fair or not, people are going to squint at the timing and wonder about the motive. And even though, in this case, I've argued the timeline doesn't support the conspiracy, because the rule changed a season before Clark's total made it matter, the perception problem is real. The league's revised technical foul structure is going to outlast this one storyline. It'll shape how future seasons unfold for players who weren't even in the WNBA when the threshold moved. What happens to Clark over the rest of the season is, in a real sense, the first big public test of whether the new number actually works the way it was meant to. And none of this is truly unique to her, in the abstract. Every heavily fouled star in basketball history has run into some version of this same math at some point. The reason this particular moment stands out is the timing of it all colliding at once. A rule that changed. A number that climbed right up to its ceiling. A star who is also, by a wide margin, the league's biggest commercial draw. And a stretch of seasons still to play that will test whether that ceiling holds up under exactly the kind of pressure it was designed to handle. Because there's a commercial dimension you can't ignore. When Caitlin Clark plays, the crowds are bigger and the television numbers are higher, and that holds up pretty much regardless of the opponent or the standings. So a suspension doesn't just cost Indiana a game in the win column. It costs the league a night of its single biggest draw, in whatever city happens to be hosting that game. That's part of why this story has legs. The stakes aren't only about the Fever's record. They're tangled up with the growth of the whole sport. So let's bring it all the way back to where we are today. Caitlin Clark has 7 technical fouls. The rule says the 8th one gets her an automatic 1-game suspension, without pay, on whatever date the schedule serves up next. She already reached 8 once, against Chicago, and only got saved when the league rescinded the call within 2 hours. That rescission was real relief, but it was also a warning shot. It showed everyone how little room is left. What changes, practically, if she crosses the line for real and there's no reversal to save her? A missed game. A fine. A night where Indiana's offense has to run without its engine, against an opponent nobody can predict, on a date nobody chose. What stays the same, either way, is the underlying situation that this whole video has traced. A star operating with almost no margin left, under a rule that was rewritten this era of the league for reasons that had nothing to do with her personally, and everything to do with how her situation happened to land right on top of it. 7 technical fouls. 1 rule that moved the line. 1 hard foul, 1 bad whistle, away from a suspension that nobody can schedule around. That is where Caitlin Clark stands for the rest of this season. Not because of one reckless moment, but because of a threshold that sits exactly 1 step in front of her, and a season long enough that the schedule is going to keep asking the question. Whether she crosses that line depends on calls that haven't been made yet, in games that haven't been played yet. What's certain is the cost if she does. 1 missing game, on a date nobody can predict, for a team built around her being on the floor. So here's my question for you, and I actually want to hear your read on this one. If you're Caitlin Clark, and you know you're 1 whistle from sitting, do you swallow every bad call for the rest of the season and let opponents chirp at you all they want? Or do you keep competing exactly the way you always have and dare the league to sit its biggest star in a big game? There's no obviously right answer, and I think reasonable people land in different places. Drop your take in the comments. Tell me what you'd do. And if this breakdown made the stakes clearer than a box score ever could, do me a favor and subscribe, because I'll be tracking this number all the way to the end of the season.